The questions I came up with this week, or this cycle, as far as how do I view my students, is how can I connect with each of my students on an individual level? How can I keep the spirit in my classroom while respecting the different ideas and beliefs of my students? And how will I help my students discover truth and knowledge for themselves? This last question is the one I'm going to focus on because I really like the idea of teaching students to learn rather than just teaching them facts. So I'm going to go with how we broke it down into like the concept maps in the idea of doctrine, principle, and tools. And the doctrine was the doctrine of knowledge. I loved what Aquinas really talked about when he talked about knowledge coming from God and that everything kind of goes up that ladder to God. He talked about a lower science depends on a higher, a music depends on arithmetic. Again, everything we learn eventually leads back to God. Plato talked about through the power of the sun, we were able to see things clearly, as they did with the people in the cave. In the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is only seen with an effort. Knowledge isn't something that we have. It is something that we have, but it's something we need to work at and something we need to gain for ourselves. The principle then would be for me to create a classroom of accountability for my students to learning for themselves. In the discussion boards, Aubrey talked about creating the right environment for learning will help students want to discover truth. And I love that. I love teaching the children to want to learn that. Mindy talked about when we discover truth for ourselves, it changes our heart and mind. Creating a culture of integrity in the classroom would help all of the students feel what integrity is, so that when they were faced with a challenge later in life, they would want to know the truth for themselves. Again, a wanting, an earning to learn for themselves. And I think it was Aubrey who shared this quote by Albert Einstein that said, "I never teach my pupils, I only provide the conditions in which they can learn." Again, going back to that accountability, having the students learn for themselves. The tools that I found, one came from the problem posing education with Freer talked about, and not having that banker mentality of just reciting information. This is where we have communication and dialogue between students and teachers. The student and teacher both learn together. It involves constant unveiling of reality, strives for emergence of consciousness and critical intervention. And one thing I loved in that Montessori video that I watched was it talked about creating a classroom of individual learning where the students learn at their own pace. And the role of the teacher was the role of an observer. We observe the students and move on when they are ready, not when we're ready to move on because of lesson plans, but when the student is ready, helping them learn when they're ready and capable of moving on. Students learn by making mistakes and correcting themselves, and they're responsible for their own belongings. Again, going back to that principle of accountability. So we can help students see and discover for themselves and open the world to them through inquisitive learning. And I'll close with this quote that I found by Clay P. Bedford that said, "You can teach a lesson for a day, but if you can teach him to learn by creating curiosity, he will continue the learning process as long as he lives." Again, creating that accountability for learning and helping the student learn throughout life and being a lifelong learner.